Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is my new time-lapse setup. It's been running for about a day now, and it was just set up and left to run. And as you might be able to see in there, there's some ice cubes. The ice cubes are trying to gradually apply moisture to the scene. And over the past day or so, I've been dropping in ice cubes to let them gradually melt and dampen the environment. But it's time to add the worms. And I'm heading into my wormery now to go get those worms rounded up so that they can be placed into this container. So let's head over there now and get to work on collecting some worms. So I got my little plastic container that I'm going to collect the worms in. And a lot of times in my videos, my time-lapse videos, I use red wiggler worms. But for this one, I thought I would use the European nightcrawlers. So I'm going to grab my VERMIBAG mini here that's got European nightcrawlers in it. Bring it over to the bench so we can fish out some volunteers for this project. Okay, I've got it over here by the bench and I've got my glove on so we can get to work. Let's get it a little bit closer with the camera. So I last fed this container 8 days ago. So my hope is that they've not yet burned through all the food that I gave them, and hopefully there's still some worms hanging out in that feeding area where I last applied food. So my hope was that I could just extract a whole bunch of material right out of the feeding area, and that hopefully it would be pretty heavily populated with a sufficient number of worms to get this project off the ground. I think maybe the best way to go about this is going to be to simply scoop out a few handfuls of material from the very middle where the last feeding occurred, and hopefully we'll be successful in rounding up a good number of worms. Okay, now it seems to me like a whole lot of extra material came along for the ride. So I think I'm just going to gradually start picking it out of here. And if we do it carefully, we should end up with just a pile of worms left. Because the worms will keep diving down as we start picking out the material in here that's not worms. And I think we've probably rounded up enough that we can get a good number of them going. So let's cover things up here, give the rest of these guys a break. But I'm not going to pack things up too much here, because if we get things all separated over there, the worms separated from the material that they're inhabiting, then we'll have a good bit of scrap material that we're not using that we can throw right back in here. So I'm going to leave this open so we've got somewhere to dump all that stuff after we're finished fishing out our volunteers. All right, this should be fun. Let's move things up to the top of the bench. So my aim is to be able to fill up about 2 cups like this. They're not very large cups. And I have one of them is sort of cut down like a little bit of a funnel. So I'm going to use this to get the worms down into that container without spilling a bunch of them. So I think this should go pretty easily. I should be able to just pretty much pull out large chunks of paper, large pieces of bedding, hopefully leaving worms behind in the process. I don't have to be overly precise either. I'm only looking to do a quick separation here. It doesn't have to be perfect. If there's still a few worms remaining on some of this bedding that I'm trying to separate away from the worms, that's fine too. It's all going right back into the compost bin. I'm just hoping to be able to be left with a good number of them, or at least enough of them to fill up those 2 cups there. I guess the nice thing about this is that the worms, all on their own, they're going to just dive down. They're going to try to take shelter from the overhead lights. So if I'm patient, I should be able to just give this pile a few minutes here and there so that the worms can clear out of view, and then I could scrape off the top surface. and then wait a few more minutes again, let them dive down once again, and then continue removing materials from here. But sometimes it's more fun just to poke around. Let's just see if we can separate them manually rather than waiting for them to dive out of view. I did something similar to this earlier today where I was removing the feeding zone out of a bin that I'm attempting to evacuate worms from. So the worms were making their way into a feeding zone, and then I pretty much extracted the entire feeding zone in order to move the worms aside. But I figured if I can separate the worms from the material that they're occupying, then I could recycle a lot of those materials that made up the feeding zone and return them to the feeding zone to continue their function in that capacity. So I've been separating worms from the material that they're inhabiting all day long. This is the second time now. So hopefully this won't take too long. Every now and then I'm able to pull out a pretty good sized chunk of food or a pretty good wad of bedding. Just a moment ago I pulled out a whole huge jumble of shredded paper bits that were all stuck together, full of worms, which is exactly what I was hoping for. I thought that a whole bunch of this paper would create an environment that the worms really like occupying, and it seems to be working just as expected. So we're making our way through here pretty gradually. But maybe I'll just go ahead and empty out what I've collected so far and make some more room in this collection box here. So we'll have less of a risk of dropping any. So let's dump this back into the Vermibag. Okay. Usually it does seem like if I just kind of comb my fingers through, I have the greatest potential of bumping into like larger chunks of things that could be easily removed. But it gradually does keep getting trickier and trickier. A lot of times it is just easiest to allow them a little bit of time to dive down and then just grab a handful right off the top. Here and there, maybe throw a worm back. We're getting there. You know, I think I'm just going to start collecting up the worms one by one. Seems like it'll be easy enough just to snatch them as soon as I see them as I'm tilling around here. A lot of times I'm just used to being able to remove a lot of the material off the top of a pile of worms. But so much of this stuff seems like it might just be coffee or something, or maybe worm castings. I'm starting to wonder if it might just be easier for me to load up 2 of these little cups this way than trying to allow for the worms to separate out of the material on their own by diving down out of the light. So this is pretty cool too. I've never really dealt with the worms on an individual basis so much. I see a lot of people doing worm work where they handle their worms one at a time for numerous things, and it's just something that I normally don't do. But in this particular case, it seemed like it would be possibly a time saver just to do it this way. I mean, just from poking around here for a few minutes, I'm already halfway filled with the first of the 2 cups. So I think this way we might be able to have our volunteers rounded up in a pretty short period of time. All right. A couple of these worms are pretty nice and hefty. Okay, well, I'm making pretty decent progress here. I've already got 1 container more or less full. Seems like they're kind of settling in, so maybe I'll throw 1 or 2 more in there if they continue to make extra space in there. Fit a few more of their brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. But I'm also starting to feel like I'm running a little bit short on remaining worms in this material. It does seem like I've picked out a good number of them. We got some more over here. I guess it wouldn't be too difficult just to go back into the Vermibag and pull out another couple handfuls of material. Should be able to pull together another few dozen worms pretty easily. Although I'm not even so sure it's so important to have so many worms, because it is a fairly small container. And I believe last time I loaded that container up with worms, it was about this many worms that I used. I think it was 2 of these types of containers filled with red wiggler worms. And I somehow felt like the bin was a little bit overpopulated. So it seems like if I stick with these 2 types of containers, but maybe I don't overfill them, because I believe that when I did the red wigglers, these things were just, you know, poor overflowing worms. This way we might be loading a slightly fewer number of worms into the container, and maybe we won't have quite as crowded a situation in there with these European nightcrawlers. So, I don't know. It's always kind of a gut instinct thing when I'm doing these time-lapse videos. I don't really have a good formula to follow. Just kind of estimating and guesstimating and hoping that my guesstimates work out well. But we're definitely running low on remaining worms to be pulled out of this material. I'm just going to pick around here a little bit more, see what else we could find. But we might be at the end here. We might have recruited all of the worms out of this material. So I guess we could just dump it all right back into the Vermibag. And then, you know, what we've got here is pretty close to what I was aiming for, I believe. Throw a few of them over here so we have 2 equal amounts. It's not bad. I'm sure if you went into a bait store and you bought this many worms, you'd probably be paying, you know, 15-20 bucks. All right, I think we've got what we came here for, although I thought I saw a couple more worms. But no, let's leave it at that. I think with this many worms we should be in good shape to have a launch party, cut these little guys loose in their new home, and let the time lapse begin. So now that I'm in the bag returning some of the material that we sifted off, I'm encountering worms, so I just can't seem to resist pulling out a couple of the more prominent, larger sized ones that I encounter here. Let's just see if we can pull out 1 or 2 more good sized volunteers, since they're right here on the top surface, pretty much asking to be picked off. Hey boy. So now we got ourselves a pretty good collection of worms that we could start this time-lapse video off with. Okay, so here I have my 2 collections of worms in my little funnel. So I'm just going to create 2 little piles of worms in here. We'll pour one of them right back into here, like so. And we'll dump the other one right next to it. Okay. That makes it official. Our new time lapse is now underway. So, alright, that's pretty much it. I didn't really intend to spend a lot of time here watching the worms. I just wanted to get them released into their new home, get this time lapse started. So that's that. We're done. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Looking forward to seeing how this time lapse turns out. All right, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks for watching. Bye.